Before the Sacklers sold pain to America. Another family had already mastered the art of addiction. They didn't just profit from drugs, they built an empire on them. They turned India into a factory, China into a nation of addicts, and the British Empire into their business partner. For a century, they ruled in silence, hiding behind titles, charities, and royal favors. But behind every palace they built was a trail of broken lives. This isn't a conspiracy. It's the origin story of global addiction. The family that addicted an empire long before the Sacklers ever existed. To understand how one family could profit from the suffering of millions, we have to travel back to 100 years, to the age when the British Empire called itself the workshop of the world. India wasn't yet a free nation. It was a corporate colony, managed not by a king, but by a company, the British East India Company. A company so powerful, had its own army, its own currency, and could declare war if profits were threatened. The British wanted Chinese silk, tea, and porcelain, luxuries they couldn't live without. But China didn't want British goods in return, so silver kept flowing out of Britain and into China. It was the first trade deficit of the modern world. And it terrified London's bankers. The solution they found would reshape history. They decided to sell China something it couldn't resist, something that would ensure endless demand: opium. At that very moment, in 1832, a Jewish merchant named David Sassoon fled persecution in Baghdad and arrived in Bombay, alone, exiled, but burning with ambition. He started small trading textiles and spices, but he had something others didn't: connections. He spoke the languages of merchants and ministers, and he understood one rule of empire: profit follows power. When the East India Company's monopoly on opium began to collapse, private traders rushed in to fill the vacuum. David Sassoon saw his chance. He built warehouses along the Indian coast, hired British captains, and quietly became the middleman between India's poppy fields and China's desperate markets. He didn't invent addiction, he industrialized it. Within a decade, Sassoon and Sons controlled the routes, the ships, and the money. Opium wasn't just a product, it was a system. Farmers in India grew it under British supervision. Sassoon ships carried it to China, and Chinese silver came back to finance Britain's next conquest. The British Empire got rich, the Sassoons got richer. And millions in China lost everything. By the 1840s, their wealth rivaled the Rothschilds. But behind their fortune, a crisis was brewing, a rebellion born from addiction, humiliation, and betrayal. Because soon, China would strike back, and the world would burn in what history calls the Opium Wars. By the 1840s, China had had enough. The Qing emperor saw his people collapsing under a wave of addiction, millions enslaved to a powder that came in through British ships. Entire villages disappeared into the haze of opium smoke. Families sold their land, their homes, even their children, for one more taste of escape. When the emperor ordered the destruction of foreign opium stockpiles in Canton, Britain didn't respond with diplomacy. It responded with warships. The First Opium War was not a fight between nations, it was a fight between morality and money. Britain fought, not for freedom, not for justice, but for the right to sell drugs. And behind the cannons, behind the sales and supply chains, stood the financiers, the opium traders, the Sassoons. As the British Navy bombarded Chinese ports, David Sassoon's sons ensured that shipments kept moving. Even as cities burned, the trade didn't stop, it expanded. When China finally surrendered, the Treaty of Nanking forced them to open ports for free trade. But this freedom was a death sentence. The opium trade was legalized, Hong Kong was handed to Britain, and merchants like the Sassoons gained unrestricted access to the Chinese market. What followed was one of the greatest wealth transfers in human history. Silver flowed out of China by the ton and into British banks and Sassoon accounts. The Sassoon dynasty had officially arrived. David Sassoon built his empire like a multinational corporation. Each son was assigned a city: Abdullah in Hong Kong, Albert in Shanghai, Elias in Bombay, and later, branches in London and Singapore. Their ships carried not just opium, but cotton, silk, tea, and later textiles, but opium remained the lifeblood. It was what paid for everything else. By the 1860s, Sassoon and Co. controlled the majority of the opium trade from India to China. Their warehouses stretched from Calcutta to Canton. Their fortune became so vast that even Queen Victoria took notice. And as their wealth grew, so did their reputation. They became respectable. David's sons funded hospitals, schools, and libraries across Bombay. They donated to British charities, hosted lavish galas, and were knighted for their service to the empire. The irony was staggering. Philanthropists by day, drug traffickers by night. But in the eyes of the world, they were gentlemen. The opium that financed their palaces was invisible. The addiction and death, conveniently foreign. To truly grasp their power, you have to understand what opium meant to the British economy. By 1850, one-third of all British imports from China were paid for with opium profits. The national drink of Britain was literally financed by drug money. The Sassoons' London agents invested that money in British railways, banks, and factories. Their capital fueled the Industrial Revolution. Every steam engine, every textile mill in Manchester, in some indirect way, was touched by the poison that flowed from India to China. And the cycle kept feeding itself. Indian farmers were forced to grow poppies instead of food, leading to famine. Chinese addicts sold everything they owned, leading to collapse. And the profits were reinvested in empire, factories, wars, colonies, an economy built on dependency. The Sassoons didn't invent this system, they optimized it. They turned addiction into a scalable business model. And they proved to the world that if you control the vice, you control the empire. By the 1850s, China tried once again to fight back. Officials in Beijing saw the empire disintegrating. Half of coastal China was addicted. Corruption spread through every layer of government. But when the emperor tried to push back, Britain, and now joined by France, launched a second war. The Second Opium War was even more brutal. The British Army looted the Summer Palace, burned cities, and imposed new treaty ports. And once again, behind the scenes, the Sassoon network expanded its reach. As Chinese resistance crumbled, they secured warehouses in Shanghai, Tianjin, and Hong Kong. They diversified, opening banks, textile factories, insurance firms, all funded by the same drug money that had destroyed millions of lives. By 1870, the Sassoons had become global power players. They owned shipping lines, mills, and trading houses. Their company logo was recognized from London to Canton, and their transformation was complete. What began as exile from Baghdad had become one of the greatest fortunes in the world. But success came with a price. As the century wore on, cracks began to show. The same empire that had made them rich was now addicted to its own system of exploitation. The British economy became dependent on opium profits, and the Chinese population, decimated by addiction, began to rebel. By the 1880s, missionaries, moral reformers, and even members of parliament started to question the morality of the trade. Reports of the opium curse spread across Europe, with sketches of emaciated Chinese men smoking in opium dens, their eyes hollow, their lives ruined. It became harder for the British government to defend the trade publicly. But for the Sassoons, it was too late to turn back. Their wealth was now embedded in the system. Banks, industries, politics, everything they touched was tainted by the same poison. David Sassoon died in 1864, leaving behind an empire worth hundreds of millions in today's terms. His sons continued to expand, some into real estate, others into finance, but the core of their power always traced back to the same source. As Britain entered the late 19th century, the Sassoons evolved once more, from drug merchants to bankers. They began investing in Rothschild-backed institutions, marrying into elite British families, and entering Parliament. Their new identity was clean, polished, untouchable. But history doesn't forget that easily, because while London celebrated their philanthropy, Shanghai was still dying from their legacy. By 1900, the tides had shifted. China was in chaos. The Qing dynasty weakened, foreign powers carving up territories, and public outrage reaching a breaking point. The opium trade had made the West rich, but it had also broken the East, and when the 20th century dawned, so did a new moral reckoning. Even the British government began to distance itself from opium. Laws were passed, commissions held, and treaties signed to gradually reduce the trade, but by then, the damage was irreversible. The Sassoon family, now firmly part of the British aristocracy, quietly shifted their focus to legitimate enterprises, banking, textiles, shipping. Their opium past was buried under titles, honors, and marble plaques. Yet the pattern they pioneered, profit through dependency, never truly died. It evolved, and a century later, it would reappear in a new form. With new players and a new kind of drug, because while the Sassoon Empire faded into respectability, their playbook survived. And in the 20th century, others would copy it, from the Sacklers in America to global pharmaceutical giants today. The tools changed, the substances changed. But the psychology of profit stayed exactly the same. History doesn't repeat itself, it reinvents itself for profit. When the 20th century began, the Sassoon name had become a mark of sophistication. They built mansions in London, funded museums, and mingled with the aristocracy. Their descendants studied at Oxford and served in Parliament. They were no longer the drug traders of Bombay, they were now the pillars of society. But behind the polished image, their fortune still pulsed with the residue of opium. The family's power had moved from the docks to the drawing rooms of finance, but the system they created never disappeared, it simply changed its packaging. As Britain retreated from the opium trade in the early 1900s, a new era of chemical innovation began. Scientists in Europe discovered new ways to refine, bottle, and brand pain. Morphine was synthesized from opium, then heroin from morphine. And just like that, addiction found a new disguise: medicine. Hospitals, pharmacies, and doctors became the new traders of relief. And while the Sassoon ships stopped carrying opium, other industries picked up the torch: pharmaceutical companies, chemical labs, and research firms that saw what the Sassoons had proven long ago: human dependency could be profitable. The same formula repeated itself, century after century: create a need, provide the solution, and make sure the solution never truly ends. By the 1920s, the British Empire had shifted its focus from drugs to finance. London was now the heart of global banking, and the Sassoons had become part of the establishment that once looked down on them. Members of the family were knighted, appointed to advisory boards, and their businesses merged with the likes of Rothschild and Co. and Barclays. But something fascinating happened. Even as the family stepped away from the opium world, their blueprint lived on in new industries, from tobacco to alcohol to pharmaceuticals. Every one of them relied on the same psychological mechanism, a promise of comfort that slowly turned into a cage. And that is where the story of the Sassoons connects to the modern world, because in the mid-20th century, another family would rise, using eerily similar methods. They wouldn't deal in opium, they'd deal in painkillers. Their name was Sackler, the parallels were uncanny. The Sacklers, like the Sassoons, began as outsiders. They entered medicine not through privilege, but through ambition and strategy. And just like the Sassoons turned opium into commerce, the Sacklers turned medicine into marketing. They sold the idea that suffering was a market, and that every human ache could and should be treated chemically. When Purdue Pharma launched OxyContin in the 1990s, it wasn't just a pill, it was a business model dressed as compassion. Doctors were told addiction was rare. Patients were told they were being cared for. And the company flooded the market with billions of doses. Within a decade, the results were catastrophic. Entire towns in America became dependent. Over 500,000 people died. And once again, a single family built a multi-billion-dollar fortune on the backs of human vulnerability. The difference was, this time, the empire didn't wear colonial uniforms. It wore lab coats and corporate suits, but the DNA of the business, the Sassoon blueprint, remained unchanged. The Sassoons discovered in the 19th century what the Sacklers rediscovered in the 20th: addiction isn't an accident. It's a system, a predictable, repeatable machine. Step 1. Identify a weakness: pain, despair, poverty. Step 2. Manufacture relief, a product that soothes but never cures. Step 3. Scale it globally, under the banner of progress. Step 4. When the backlash comes, rebrand, relocate, and repeat. The East India Company did it with opium. Big Pharma did it with painkillers. And today, the pattern has simply evolved into digital and financial addiction. Because now, the most addictive substances aren't just chemical, they're psychological. Social media, fast-trading apps, dopamine-driven entertainment, modern systems of control that feed the same human craving: escape. The players are new, but the story is ancient. Empires may fall, but the economy of dependency survives every collapse. Back in the 1930s, a new generation of Sassoons tried to shed their past entirely. They distanced themselves from the family's opium roots, built textile mills in Shanghai and Bombay, and invested in modern industries. One descendant, Victor Sassoon, became one of the wealthiest men in Asia. He built luxury hotels in Shanghai, airlines in India, and lived like royalty, often called the Gatsby of the East, but history has a cruel sense of irony. The city that made him rich, Shanghai, was built on the wealth his ancestors had extracted through opium. By the time World War II broke out, the Sassoon Empire was scattered across continents. Their properties were seized by the Japanese, their influence in Asia evaporated, and their wealth slowly declined. The family that once addicted an empire was now watching its own power fade. Yet the system they helped create didn't die with them. Opium transformed into morphine, morphine transformed into heroin. Heroin transformed into OxyContin. And now, OxyContin has transformed into something else entirely, dopamine itself. Every era finds a new drug, every generation finds a new dealer. The deeper tragedy of the Sassoon legacy isn't just what they did, it's what they taught the world. They taught governments how to justify exploitation through trade. They taught corporations how to disguise addiction as innovation. And they taught humanity that morality will always lose when profit is limitless. That's why history matters. Because we like to think of addiction as a modern disease, a byproduct of modern capitalism, but in truth, it's an ancient engine, refined over centuries. The Sassoons didn't just sell drugs, they sold a philosophy that human suffering could be monetized. And that idea became the invisible foundation of the global economy we live in today. Even today, when you trace the networks of global finance, offshore banks, trade monopolies, political donations, pharmaceutical lobbying, you'll find echoes of that 19th century opium empire. Different names, different faces, but the same DNA: create demand, control supply, extract wealth. We've replaced opium dens with smartphones and trading houses with algorithms. But the psychology hasn't changed. We're still trapped in the same transaction: comfort for control. As the 20th century gave way to the 21st, the Sassoon name faded from headlines. Most people today have never heard of them. Their family archives are locked away, their portraits hang quietly in museums, and their story is rarely mentioned in textbooks. But if you follow the money, if you follow the systems that still rule our world, you realize their legacy never really disappeared. It simply evolved, from opium to oil, from painkillers to pixels, from physical addiction to psychological dependence. The family that addicted an empire didn't just change history, they became history. Today, when we talk about addiction, we think of pills, screens, or vices. But at its core, addiction is a business model. A mechanism refined over centuries, built not by chemists, but by empires. The Sassoons didn't just sell opium. They proved that control over desire was more powerful than control over land. And that insight changed everything. Because once you understand how to sell escape, you no longer need to conquer nations, you can conquer minds. Let's look at the world now. More people today are addicted than at any point in human history, not just to substances, but to stimulation. The global pharmaceutical market is worth over $1.5 trillion. The digital attention economy, driven by social media, gaming, and online consumption, exceeds $4 trillion. And global consumer debt has reached $350 trillion because we've learned to borrow, buy, and binge just to feel temporary relief. Pain is still the product, relief is still the illusion. The only thing that's changed is the delivery system. Instead of opium, we scroll. Instead of pipes, we have phones. Instead of traders, we have algorithms. And the same psychological dependency that once built the Sassoon Empire now fuels global markets every single day. Let's connect the dots. In the 1800s, Britain flooded China with opium, creating a nation of addicts, then used that dependency to control its economy and politics. Today, multinational corporations flood the world. With instant gratification, dopamine hits disguised as entertainment or wellness, creating a population too distracted to question the system that traps them. The mechanics are identical. Then it was the East India Company. Now it's big tech and big pharma, both sell comfort, both collect data, both promise freedom while feeding dependency. And in both cases, the profits are astronomical. When David Sassoon built his empire in Bombay, a pound of opium bought for 5 silver coins could sell in China for 500. Today, a pill that costs 50 cents to produce can sell for $40 at a pharmacy. A single viral app can be valued at $100 billion for one reason, because it owns attention. That's the new opium, the drug of the digital empire. And here's the cruel irony. The Sassoon dynasty eventually collapsed, their empire dissolved into history. But the system they created outlived them, not through trade, but through technology. The addiction economy became self-perpetuating. It no longer needs one family or one product. It only needs us, our time, our clicks, our impulses. Every scroll, every swipe, every buy now button feeds the same machine. That started on the docks of Bombay 200 years ago. We are no longer just the audience. We are the market, and we are the product. History's cruelest lesson is that exploitation never truly dies. It just evolves into something we call progress. When opium destroyed millions of lives in China, the world called it trade. When OxyContin destroyed millions of lives in America, the world called it medicine. And today, when attention addiction reshapes our psychology, the world calls it innovation. That's how every empire justifies its success, by rebranding destruction as development. But underneath every version, the equation remains constant. A small group profits from the predictable weakness of the masses. It's easy to judge the Sassoons from a distance to say, I would never do that, but what if the truth is more uncomfortable? What if every one of us is now complicit in a modern version of the same system? We trade our focus for convenience, our privacy for comfort, our independence for speed. We build lives around products designed to keep us hooked, and we call it normal. Maybe we've just replaced opium with options. The Sassoon story isn't just about one family's greed, it's a mirror of humanity's own nature, a reflection of how easily we surrender control when relief is dangled in front of us. Because the real empire was never Britain or the Sassoons, it was addiction itself. A silent, invisible empire that still rules the modern world, not through guns, but through gratification. So, what can we learn from this? 3 takeaways stand out, and they're more urgent than ever. 1. Every empire ends, but its systems survive. The Sassoons may have vanished, but their addiction model still drives modern economies. The names change, the pattern doesn't. To break free, we must recognize systems that profit from dependency before they evolve again. 2. History doesn't repeat, it monetizes. From opium to OxyContin to online dopamine, every generation believes it's more advanced. Yet every era finds new ways to sell the same illusion, control through consumption. Understanding this loop is the first step toward breaking it. 3. The most valuable commodity isn't gold, oil, or data, it's attention. Whoever controls attention controls behavior. Whoever controls behavior controls societies. And just as the Sassoons once captured China through opium, today's powers capture the world through screens. If you trace this pattern forward, you see where it leads. Empires may no longer invade territories, but they invade minds. Nations no longer enslave through chains, but through choices. Addiction has become the most efficient form of control ever invented, because people willingly participate in it. That's the real genius of modern empires. So, the next time you open your phone, take a pill, or scroll endlessly through feeds designed to keep you hooked, remember this: once upon a time, a family no one remembers discovered the secret to ruling the world. They didn't build armies, they built dependency. And that's how the Sassoons, the family that addicted an empire, changed history forever. Because they didn't just create addiction, they perfected it. The camera lingers on an old black and white photo, David Sassoon standing proudly beside his sons in Bombay. Ships lined with crates of opium behind them. The image slowly fades into modern skyscrapers, pharmaceutical logos, and glowing smartphone screens. The past doesn't disappear. It rebrands. If this story opened your eyes, don't just move on to the next video. Ask yourself, what are you addicted to, and who's profiting from it? Because until we question our dependencies, history will keep repeating itself with new dealers, new drugs, and the same old empire of addiction. If you found this story as haunting as it is revealing, hit subscribe and stay tuned, because in the next episode, we're uncovering the hidden financial networks That turned the opium trade into the backbone of global capitalism itself. The Sassoons may have built the blueprint, but the empire, it never ended.